Florida's population added 2.7 million new residents in the last decade, according to the 2020 census. This enabled the state to add a 28th congressional district. The additional seat and the redrawing of the maps by the Republican-led state legislature is carving up existing districts and diluting the black vote. The Florida House and Senate have proposed new congressional maps. The House-drawn map would shrink the heavily Democratic 7th congressional district. With that map, the increasingly Democratic Seminole County would shift into a Republican-led district. In contrast, the western portion of the district would shift to a predominantly black area of Orlando. The changes to the 7th congressional district would essentially force Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, a Democrat, to run for a seat in a Republican-leaning county or compete against another Democrat. Political analysts have noted that Florida's gerrymandering efforts may be among the most aggressive in the country. It also reduces the number of majority black districts and eliminates one of Dade County's majority Hispanic districts. This has emerged as a troubling pattern in Republicans' gerrymandering this cycle, the drawing away of seats of black lawmakers. So far, we have seen Florida, Texas, Georgia, and Ohio take aim at the seats of black people in Congress. Joining us to discuss is author David Daley, senior fellow for the nonprofit FairVote, and radio talk show host Reverend Mark Thompson. So, Mr. Daley, I want to start with you. So the vast majority of the growth in this state was black and brown people. This is the same thing that happened in Texas, same thing that happened in Georgia. But Republicans take that growth, the seats that growth provides them with, and they turn it and use it for what is essentially majority white constituencies, which are Republican constituencies. What is your take on what is happening in state after state after state along this line of racial partisan gerrymandering?
This has been an absolute partisan bloodbath, this entire redistricting cycle. You're exactly right. What we are seeing is that Republicans are using their advantages in state legislatures to draw themselves districts that they cannot lose. They are also using that advantage essentially as a firewall against the kinds of demographic change that is happening in this country as we become a more multiracial nation. When you look at Texas, 95% of the population growth in Texas that earned the state an additional 2 seats in the U.S. House through a reapportionment was due to Latino, Black, and Asian population growth. And yet the maps in Texas actually increase white, rural, conservative Republican power at the expense of those growing populations. We are seeing the exact same thing happen in Florida, in Georgia, in North Carolina. This has been the trend across the country. Republicans are going to use redistricting to lock themselves in power in a nation that is changing, that looks much less like them. They're going to be almost impossible to beat.
Reverend Thompson, how do you break out of that? What are the mechanisms that can be used to stop this or fight back against it? If they lock themselves into districts that they cannot lose, as David was just describing, presumably they are still in control the next time you have to draw the maps. How do you break out of the cycle?
Well, a couple of ways to answer that question. We have to look forward to the future. The past couple of election cycles were unprecedented in terms of turnout and participation for all of the constituencies in the Democratic base. That's a good thing. But that was on the national level. I'm sure David would agree, and he and I have talked about this. We have to place more emphasis on down ballot elections, because it is in these statewide elections where representatives, state representatives are elected to redraw the maps and do the redistricting. So this has got to become second nature, voting at the national level and second nature voting at the down ballot level. That's long term. Can't do that. Can't do anything about that today. What needs to happen today in the immediate is that the party that the overwhelming votes came out for from the Democratic base, Democratic Party, needs to get its members to line up. Manchin and Sinema need to, before Christmas, get whatever voting legislation is still on the table, be it John Lewis or For the People or Freedom to Vote, whatever it is, to prevent this type of gerrymandering. Otherwise, as David said, we're in a very dangerous place, because what the Democratic base constituency is going to say is, why should we be as enthusiastic voting for Democrats when they won't even protect our right to vote? It doesn't make sense to me. This is an existential threat to the majority the Democratic Party holds. It's obviously then an existential threat to Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, everyone involved, and to allow just 2 Democrats in the Senate to destroy the party is baffling.
So, David, I want to kick that to you, because, even if it looks like Republicans are doing this, suppressing the vote in 2 ways on 2 fronts. On the statewide level, they're just basically trimming down the number of people, the kinds of people who can vote, right? That's classic voter suppression. And then, on these district levels, they're basically packing everyone in, black people, Asian people, into smaller districts. So it doesn't really matter how many of them come out to vote. You can vote your heart out. If you are only able to win 3 seats because you're all packed into 3 districts, it really does not matter how many of you show up to vote. So how do you take that message to voters? Because they may, in fact, come out. They may be enthusiastic. They may say, I really want to see Congress change. But if your state has packed you into 3 districts and they're reserving 9, there's very little that you can do.
We have to take that message to Joe Biden in the White House, because they believe that it's still possible to out-organize partisan gerrymandering. And the lesson of the last decade of our politics is that you can't do that, for precisely the reason that you said. You end up running up the score in the 2 or 3 districts in that state that you're able to win. And, as a result, you have what happened back in 2012, for example, when Democratic candidates for the U.S. House won 1.4 million more votes nationally, but Republicans held on to the U.S. House by 33 seats, and Barack Obama's second-term agenda was essentially dead on the evening that he was reelected. You're completely correct as well that these 2 pieces, partisan gerrymandering, racial gerrymandering, and voter suppression, fit together, right? Because the first thing that states that have been gerrymandered do is they go after voting rights. So first they pack and crack Democrats, black voters, other racial minority groups into a handful of districts. And that assures them victories in legislative races. But they still have to find a way to diminish those votes in the statewide races as well, right? You look at Georgia back in 2021, where those 2 runoff races went to the Democrats, very close in statewide races. So you go ahead and you do these little maneuvers to try to make it harder for a handful of people here and a handful of people there. You make it tougher to get an absentee ballot. You close precincts. You ensure lines. You purge voter rolls. You take away water from people who are standing in those 8-hour lines. And in states like Georgia, in states like Arizona, where 10,000 votes made the difference at the presidential level in 2020, that can be enough of a difference to really affect huge outcomes.
Right. Reverend Mark Thompson and David Daley, thank you both for joining me tonight. We have an update in the Atlanta mayoral race, this one coming from the New York Times, with 49,037 votes reported. Andrew Dickens is holding it on to 61.8% of the vote, and Felicia Moore at 38.2%.